Hello interwebs and welcome to my channel. So, a couple of weeks ago, one of the most anticipated video game releases of 2020, The Last of Us Part 2 finally released. And oh boy, even before this game came out, it was incredibly divisive, with a lot of people being really upset with some of the story leaks that came out around this game, and feeling that some of the things that happen in the story totally ruined the legacy of the first Last of Us game. And that only got compounded once the video game came out, with a lot of people calling the game a critical masterpiece, a masterpiece of gaming, and some people, again, they felt like it ruined the legacy of the first game. So for this video, I want to talk about how, actually, in my opinion, The Last of Us Part 2 takes some of the ideas present in how The Last of Us Part 1 was revolutionary in its use of the video game medium, and how it takes those ideas and extrapolates them even further in The Last of Us Part 2 to tell a story that is not only specifically using the medium of video games in a very unique way that I think few other video games and video game stories have done, but also uses that to tell a story that is incredibly germane and prescient to a lot of the discussion going on in the world today, and tells a very, very surprisingly, I don't want to say political, but very, like I said, prescient story than I think any other video games have done. And again, uses the video game medium in such a way that I don't think, if you had told this story through like a movie or something, it wouldn't have been able to make you feel the same exact way as another game. And it's not the way that you think, just by, you know, making us feel empathy for a character that you wouldn't have expected. Now, two things before I jump into all of that. First, one of the things that I know a lot of people want me to talk about is the LGBTQ and trans issues present in The Last of Us Part 2. I've already done some videos talking about a lot of the transphobia that existed before the game came out, and I know a lot of people have been asking me to do a discussion on the issues of LGBTQ and trans representation in The Last of Us Part 2 that are there within the game itself and on the game's own terms, now that we actually have the game in front of us. I will be doing that in a separate video that will be coming out next week, so if you want that discussion, that will be coming next week, and so be looking for that video on my discussion of the transgender representation in The Last of Us Part 2. But also, the second caveat before I get started is, obviously, it should go without saying, but I'm going to need to talk full spoilers about this game, so if you have not played The Last of Us Part 2, you need to go play it and then come back and join this discussion, because I'm going to go full bore spoilers here. Okay, so as I've teased at the beginning, I think that this game, The Last of Us Part 2, does something that only video games could do. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, going full spoilers, the game's story revolves around the fact that Joel, the main character from the first game, gets brutally murdered by the character of Abby at the beginning of The Last of Us Part 2, which sets Ellie, basically Joel's surrogate daughter, on a quest for revenge, and you basically play the first half of the game as Ellie, with her going after Abby and trying to get revenge on Abby. But then, surprise, surprise, the game switches narratives once the two meet, and you start to play as Abby for the second half of the game. And then the game, at the end, reverses back to Ellie as she finishes out her quest to get revenge on Abby. A lot has already been said about that narrative structure, about the twist of the game. Number one, of killing Joel, a character that we all came to know and love, and then making us as the player feel Ellie's righteous anger. In the beginning half of this game, we are right with Ellie. We feel what she feels. We, as is evidenced by the controversy around, you know, when the game's story leaked, people were very upset that Joel was killed. Even though Joel was an imperfect character in the first game. We are right with Ellie. We feel what she feels. We feel the same exact emotion that she does of wanting to get revenge. But then, the game switches perspectives and makes you play as Abby, and takes us on a full story, basically the same length of story that Ellie had, of playing as Abby and getting to know her world, her characters, and trying to get us to empathize with Abby's story and make us feel for Abby. That may work for some people, it may not. Some people may not feel anything for Abby's story. For me personally, I actually really connected with Abby's story. It made her feel like a three-dimensional character. I actually liked some of the characters in Abby's story a lot more than I like characters in Ellie's story. And I really felt like Abby became a full three-dimensional character. So much so, to the point that when we meet back up and the story connects with both Ellie and Abby, I didn't want either of them to die. And the way that this story is structured is you really feel like both characters, one of them has to die for the other to live. If we're gonna, you know, quote Harry Potter, I guess. That feeling that Ellie wants to kill Abby, and Abby, at least to some degree at some points after that point, wants to get revenge on Ellie for killing her friends, at least feel some anger. The two characters have an anger for each other that we as the player, if we do feel sympathy for both Ellie and Abby, don't feel. At that point in the game, once I finally played both of their stories, I felt sympathy for both of them. And I, to a degree, understood both's feelings of anger for each other. And in that feeling, it pushed me out as the player of the game. The final, fourth of this game, the final section where Ellie goes after Abby one last time to try and finally kill her in the Santa Barbara section of the game, I didn't want to be playing that. I didn't agree. I didn't want Ellie to make the choices that she made, to leave her family, to go out and try to kill Abby. And I also didn't want her to kill Abby in general because I started to empathize with Abby. And so this is the feeling that I think a lot of people got caught up on. That, number one, they didn't want to feel empathy for Abby. And even if they did feel empathy for Abby, they were upset that Ellie would make this choice to sort of ruin her life, leave this family that she created to basically just finish off this destruction of Abby. And they felt that this game, the story that this game was telling was like, oh yeah, violence is bad, revenge is bad, we shouldn't do revenge. But I actually think this game does something a little bit deeper than that, and it goes back to what The Last of Us Part 1 did. The way that game ends, it presents a moral choice. Joel is basically asked this question of, should he let Ellie die, this character he's come to love, should he let her die in order to save humanity, or should he save Ellie and rescue her because he cares more for Ellie and her life? Now, normally in pretty much any other video game, that would actually be a choice that we as the player would get to make. It would present us with a dialogue box and say, let Ellie die, let Ellie live. And you get to wrestle with the moral choices of that. You'd get one or the other option. Because that's what video games do. Video games are based around this concept of agency. We are players playing the game. We are putting ourselves in that story. That's what most video games do. But The Last of Us Part 1 didn't do that. It did something different. It pushed us out of the game and forced us to play Joel's decision of wanting to rescue Ellie at the cost of saving the rest of humanity, and even Ellie's express wishes of wanting to do that. The ending of the game was not our choices, but Joel's, specifically Joel's choice. And so at the end of the game, we felt pushed out as the player because we didn't have to have agency. Even if you agreed with Joel, I'm not saying there was no morally right or wrong answer there. It's all shades of gray. That's kind of the point. But the real point is that we didn't get to have agency in that as players. It was Joel's story. But the interesting part with that, though, is that some of us may have agreed with Joel. Some of us may have believed that Joel's life had more value on its own than her sacrifice would have made. So in some ways, while we were pushed out in not being able to make that choice in the story at the game, we might have agreed with Joel. But Last of Us Part 2, I think in many ways, for most players, did something a little bit different. In that, by the end of the game, I think most of us, some people probably still wanted to kill Abby, but most of us did not want to do what Ellie did. Even if people wanted Ellie to kill Abby, even if you still hated Abby even after her story, Ellie destroys her life, leaves her family, leaves this family that she created in order to go after Abby. And she sacrifices so much. And so one of the feelings that I found so interesting at the end of The Last of Us Part 2 was when I finally got to that final fight between Ellie and Abby, when they're in the water and Ellie forces Abby to fight her, forces them to have a fight to the death. I didn't want to do it. There was moments where you're throwing Abby under the water, you're drowning her, you're choking her out, and the game is telling you to press square, and I didn't want to press it. I didn't want to do it, but in order to get to the end game, to get to the credit screen, to beat the game, I needed to do that. I was forced to do Ellie's story. I was forced out of her viewpoint because I was forced to look at both sides of this fight, to feel empathy for both sides of these characters, to realize that there's no morally right or wrong here. Maybe Abby does deserve justice, and maybe she does deserve to die for the way she killed Joel, but honestly, does it matter? Would it make sense? I mean, if she kills Abby, what does that leave Lev, the character that Abby is taking care of? Does Lev deserve to not have a protector, to have someone who cares about him? The game uses the medium of video games to do what video games normally don't do, force you to realize that you have no agency in this story. Instead of a movie where you're just passively watching it anyways and watching what a character does, this game gives you agency and then takes it away. You feel your lack of agency in a way that movies don't let you feel. Movies never let you feel a lack of agency. It's just because that's the nature of the medium. You don't feel it, it just is. Whereas taking the agency that you normally would have away from you in a video game makes you feel that void and that disparity between the two of you even more. I hinted at the beginning of this game, or this video, about why I think that that's a prescient issue here. And I don't want to say it's a political issue in the thing of like what normally people would say is like, oh, well, both sides have good points. I don't think that this game is trying to say like, oh, both Ellie and Abby are both equally wrong, both equally right, both have valid points. What I think this game is trying to say is that sometimes we get so wrapped up in the fight. We get so wrapped up in winning the argument, in having our own viewpoints validated and having our own side win, that we lose everything else that actually matters to us. We would rather lose everything. We would rather lose everything in order just to win an argument, in order to win a fight. And again, it's not necessarily having a moral judgment on who's right and who's wrong here, but just saying maybe sometimes we need to pull back and look at what is actually happening and say, is doing this fight, is doing this thing, is just winning, is winning this argument the thing that needs to be done right now? Does it even matter in the grand scheme of things, or am I just doing it just to do it and ending up hurting myself and this other person as a result? I see this all the time on YouTube with just pointless arguments where, we get, even the discussion around the game in general, but people like hating this game, just like, oh, I hate The Last of Us Part 2 without actually having played the game. And even when they play the game, they don't budge on their viewpoint just because, and I'm not saying people can't hate the game, but I'm saying there are some people out there who probably would have loved this game, but just got so entrenched in their viewpoint that they wouldn't open themselves up to the possibility of liking it. And so I honestly think there's an interesting, I find it kind of hilarious that the thing that this game was against, the message that this game was trying to sell, is exactly what happened around the game because the story leaked online. There's a weird and interesting meta-narrative that I'm almost like, wow, maybe that was even planned by the developers. I don't think it actually was, but like it's just interesting that that sort of narrative got played out in the discussion of the game itself, these varying perspectives and being unable to take ourselves out of the viewpoint. And so what I really love about The Last of Us Part 2, this is why I didn't want to just do a review, why I'd rather have this discussion, is because I feel like the game taking away our agency, not just being a passive story, but giving us agency and then taking it away from us, forces us to look at these characters and say, what's the point? Why are we doing these endless fights that are just to gratify ourselves, just for our own self-gratification, and really end up doing more harm to both sides rather than they do good? And again, like I said, just to wrap out, just being very careful there. This is not saying both sides are equal. I will never say, as much as I do think, liberals and the leftist sides does have problems, I definitely think, if I'm talking politics, to get into politics and stuff, I definitely think there's a lot more morally right on the left than there is on the right, just from my point of view on things. Even though I do think the left does have some problems, but I definitely think there's a distinct difference between saying the left has some problems and saying like, oh, both sides are equally wrong. Like, I don't think that's true. And I don't think this game is saying that. I'm just saying that sometimes we get our egos and need for self-gratification so wrapped up in a fight that we lose perspective. And I think that this game does so and uses video games brilliantly to share that message. But what do you think? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below on this game. Do you agree with my assessment of the thematic themes within The Last of Us Part 2? I'd love to hear all that down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more discussions like this. Also for my transgender discussion of The Last of Us Part 2 coming up next week, and other LGBTQ issues in geek culture. I talk about all that on this channel. You can also help me out over on Patreon. I'd love some support over there. It really helps me do better on this channel, get more equipment, things like that. But regardless, if you comment, subscribe, or give over on my Patreon, I'm just glad that you stopped by and hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Thank you so much to all my patrons who support me over on Patreon, and an extra special thanks to my commander level and above patrons, Ashley Allen Bocello, Miranda Janelle, Eli Berg-Moss, Ashlyn Solstice, Christina Dalliance, Greg Gillum, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Wayne Twitchell, Ish the Mad, Buttoneer, Randy Thompson, Mouse Pounder, Jemshin, Susan Banks, Wellington Marcus, Lorena Mesa, Alexander Miller, John Steele, William Stewart, Michael Beam, Gavin Robinson, Aaron Brown, Christy Marie Johnson, Jason Knott, Maggie Evans, Maeve, Subraxis, Zach Cody, Dante St. James, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Auntie Cat 808, Patrick Shannon, Din Hagney, Mark the Edge, Bree Beecher, Polly Mina, and Gretchen Badger. Thank you to all of you. I couldn't do this without you, so thank you so much for your support.